Section 17 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 13, Moore and Fisher, 1531 to 1535, Part 1. As the year 1531 proceeded, things began to appear as if Henry might possibly shake off his ignoble bondage. The insolence of the favourite alienated many of her friends, while others, when promoted, became far less inclined than before to hazard anything for her. Both her father and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, began to fear the results of popular anger if they sanctioned the marriage. Even some of Henry's agents at Rome, while seeming to press the Pope hard, were privately conjuring him to remain firm. The cause, they said, ought to be heard at Rome and decided in favour of Catherine, and Henry would certainly give way if the Pope persisted. The king still saw his wife sometimes, and curiously enough used to refer to her when his wardrobe required attention. It seemed more than doubtful whether he would long endure being rated by his mistress for timidity in not putting obstacles aside, and above all for not holding his own in disputes with Catherine on her marriage. Warham was dying and repentant for former concessions. There was therefore no hope of assistance from him. Anne herself appeared to be providing for adversity. She was created Marchioness of Pembroke, and property was settled upon her and the heirs of her body, whether legitimate or not, so that it appeared as if she might soon be a mere discarded mistress. She was to go with Henry to meet Francis I. near Calais, but there was a world of difficulty in procuring either English ladies to attend or French ladies of any character to meet her. Indeed, any French alliance was in itself as unpopular as ever. Anne would hardly have weathered the storm but for the help she got from Cromwell, who had been in the king's confidence since 1530, and from Cranmer, who succeeded Warham as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533. Cranmer had been first a tutor in Lord Wiltshire's family, then chaplain to Lord Rochford and to the king. He had also gone abroad on the king's service, and had married the niece of the German reformer Osiander, an act which made him liable to prosecution at any moment. His great claim to Henry's favour had been his scheme of 1530 for coercing the Pope in the divorce question by the opinions of English and foreign universities. This obtained something like what it desired from the heads of houses, doctors and proctors of Oxford, all other resident members having been prudently shut out from the deliberation. The other university yielded somewhat more easily to Cranmer as a Cambridge man. Among the German Protestants, Cranmer had little success, in spite of his connection with them. At Paris a faintly approving opinion was obtained by Francis's management, and that this might not be cancelled afterwards, the registers of the university were spirited away. The academic bodies under the Emperor's control would of course have no liberty of action, so that the net result of the appeal was meagre in the extreme, and what there was had been obtained either by threats or bribery. The questions which arose on Cranmer's promotion were, first, whether the Pope would sanction it, and then whether he would issue the bulls for it without the usual payment of annates to the amount of 10,000 ducats. Henry met this difficulty in a characteristic way. Parliament had enacted in 1532 that annates should not be paid in future to Rome, but they had appended to their bill a provision that it should not come into force before Easter 1533, unless the king ordered that it should do so by letters patent. Henry therefore allowed it to be understood that if Cranmer's business was expedited, this unwelcome law might never be enforced, and the Pope, in his ignorance of the new archbishop's real character, fell helplessly into the snare. Even the Emperor did not see what was coming, in spite of the warning of the acute Chapuis, his ambassador in England, but thought it impossible that Henry should persist so long in a whim. He must surely have made Anne a marchioness in order to get rid of her. The result was that the bulls were passed, and only half the usual fee exacted. Before they arrived, however, the state of the Marchioness of Pembroke made a prompt resolution necessary if appearances were to be saved. A public wedding was out of the question. It would at once have stopped Cranmer's bulls and led to an excommunication. The only remedy was that it should be solemnised privately, and with such success was this done that even now it is not known certainly by what priest it was performed or when. The date, however, was about January 25th, 1533. The secret remained an open one for a few weeks, during which with some difficulty an Act of Parliament was passed forbidding appeals to Rome in matrimonial causes, and the convocation of the clergy was induced by various manoeuvres to declare the king's first marriage invalid. On the 10th of May the new archbishop opened a court at Dunstable, summoned Catherine to appear, declared her contumacious for not doing so, and then gave sentence that her marriage had been invalid all along. A few days afterwards another session was held, and the king's last marriage declared to be regular. But when Anne went in state to the Tower, the people would by no means take off their caps or shout "God save the Queen." And when she was first prayed for in a church, the congregation went out in a body. Meanwhile, Catherine, on her enforced journey from Ampthill to Bucton, was cheered by crowds of people who cried "God bless her," and declared that she was the one true queen. The Princess Mary was equally popular, and owed her quiet succession long after to the still living memories of this time. Anne tried in vain to make Henry punish such disloyalty. Her influence was already abating, and within 3 months he was telling her that she must shut her eyes to his amourette, as her betters had done before her. On the 11th of September the long-expected child was born, but it was a daughter after all, in spite of the predictions of a host of astrologers and wizards who had been consulted. In the midst of the king's disappointment he was mean enough to order that his daughter Mary should come to Hatfield and enter the service of the infant Elizabeth, while Anne with characteristic coarseness declared that she would make Mary act as her lady's maid, and even after a while give petulant orders that she should be beaten if she claimed the title of princess. The course taken by the Pope and Emperor was now dangerously serious and dignified. When asked whether he would undertake the deposition of Henry if the Pope pronounced it, Charles replied that he could not give such a pledge upon a mere contingency, but that His Holiness would always find him an obedient son of the Church. The Pope therefore annulled Cranmer's acts at Dunstable, July 11th, 1533, and declared that Henry would be excommunicated at the end of September if he had not separated from Anne before that time. This was likely to be no brutum fulmen, for English discontent was quite prepared to welcome the Emperor, who, as the supreme authority of Europe, might place on the throne either James of Scotland or one of the Pole family, the descendants of George, Duke of Clarence, Edward IV.'s brother. Henry had tried to meet the excommunication beforehand by an appeal to a general council. Not only, however, was this clearly against the papal constitutions, but it annoyed Francis I., who was unwilling to offend the Pope by repeating the very demand for a council which the Emperor was constantly making. To reinforce his position, he asked the Privy Council in the following December to advise him first whether the Pope is superior or inferior to a general council, and secondly whether he has by God's law more authority than other bishops. Cranmer was the only prelate who gave the negative answer fully and at once, but the replies were on the whole considered sufficient, and orders were issued that all preachers at St. Paul's Cross, as well as the heads of the 4 orders of friars, should declare their assent to this doctrine. The king was farther encouraged by an opportunity which seemed to offer itself of heading a North European League, independent of French and imperial politics. A Lubeck captain named Marcus Meyer, who was charged with piracy for attacking Dutch vessels in English harbours, had the address to persuade him that, as the King of Denmark was just dead, he might get himself chosen as his successor, and then form with Lubeck, as the head of the still powerful Hanseatic League, a combination strong enough to face all enemies. Though this fanciful project came to nothing, it still inspirited Henry at one of the most difficult and cheerless periods of all his life. Thus encouraged, he declared that unless the Pope consented in 9 weeks to cancel the sentence of July by declaring his first marriage null and void and his second valid, he would separate England from the Roman obedience altogether. Yet it was most doubtful whether he would be able to carry the people with him. Indeed, within a few weeks a bold preacher said to his face that the Pope's authority is the highest on earth, and what Hugh Latimer thus dared to tell him openly, tens of thousands must have been feeling in their hearts. Henry was now threatened at home by the terrors of superstition. A peasant girl named Elizabeth Barton had for some years been known as a kind of ecstatica. She constantly fell into convulsions, during which she uttered words surprising for their persuasive or terrifying power, and also appeared to know events of which she could not have been informed in any natural way. She must evidently be inspired, people thought, either by the Spirit of God or by Satan, and as all her utterances were in favour of holiness, the latter could hardly be her case. The rector of Aldington, in which parish she lived, thought it well to make her known to Warham as his diocesan. The archbishop felt much as St. Bernard did when the sayings of Hildegard were reported to him. He declared that the words which she had spoken came from God, and commended her to the care of Father Bocking of Christ Church, Canterbury, and some other monks. Under these auspices she was miraculously cured of her random and irregular trances. Thenceforward they returned upon her at intervals of a fortnight, and on these occasions she was consulted as an inspired person about church matters of all kinds. Her answer strongly denounced the system of interference with church privileges, and when the divorce question arose, she issued, in the name and by the authority of God, a solemn prohibition to the king, declaring that if he parted from his wife he should not reign a month, but should die a villain's death. And the Pope was similarly threatened if he complied. No punishment, however, was for the time inflicted on her, and she presently entered the priory of St. Sepulchre, Canterbury, and was known as Sister Elizabeth, the Nun of Kent. When Henry was returning from Calais with Anne, she met him on the way with her raven prophecies of evil to come. That the days were at hand when statesmen would hold her inspiration as cheaply as Voltaire himself might have done. A spy of Cromwell's was the first to put him on the track of an important conspiracy in which she was to be an instrument. Cranmer was ordered to examine her, and by feigning to believe, as Warham had believed in her visions, he obtained a good deal of information. The papers of her accomplices were seized, and it actually appeared that among those who were in correspondence with her was Sir Thomas More, who had resigned the Great Seal, May 16th, 1532, from disgust at the anti-papal measures then passing through Parliament, with Bishop Fisher, the Marchioness of Exeter, who was a strong friend of Mary's, the Countess of Salisbury, Reginald Pole's mother, and many other eminent persons. Nothing was, however, found implicating either Catherine or Mary. The juncture was indeed a serious one. A war with Charles was impending, which, if it took place, would ruin English trade. Some fresh measures lately taken for the punishment of Lutheranism and the prohibition of foreign books were beyond measure unpopular, and the feeling for the injured Mary was more passionate than ever. It was not hard to foretell the consequences if at some critical moment a band of fanatical friars, backed by the nuns' inspiration, went abroad among the people to preach that Henry was God forsaken, especially as everyone knew that the fearful peasant war in Germany had been stirred up by an enthusiast of the nun's type. Accordingly, the nun was made to read at St. Paul's Cross an acknowledgment of her imposture, and then committed with her accomplices to the Tower to wait for the meeting of Parliament in January 1534. A bill of attainder was then brought in against her and the monks who had helped her, and they were all executed April 21st. The bill at first included the names of Sir Thomas More as well as of Bishop Fisher. The House of Lords, however, were of opinion that there was no sufficient evidence against More. Fisher was held to be guilty of misprision of treason, that is, of having countenanced and favoured it, and was committed to the Tower, his only defence being that though he had really thought the nun inspired, he had never had the least notion of fulfilling her warnings by conspiracy. With regard to the other persons suspected in various degrees, the risk which they had run, and the knowledge that they were liable to be questioned again at any time, might perhaps keep them from farther plans against Henry, therefore no steps were taken against them. At the same time Parliament abolished Peter's pence and all the varieties of payment to the Pope from England, yet intimated that the act was not irrevocable if His Holiness should consent to the divorce. The mode of appointment to bishoprics was also nakedly and statutably reduced to what had been essentially the established practice. In the case of a vacancy, that is, the cathedral chapter was to be admonished by a congé d'élire from the crown to choose, as they regarded the welfare of their souls, a fit and proper person for the see. But at the same time a second document was to be placed in their hands, naming the person whom they were to elect, with praemunire in case of refusal. On this footing such elections have remained ever since, except in part of Edward VI.'s reign, during which bishops exercised their office on a simple patent from the crown, as indeed those of the Irish Church did up to its disestablishment in 1869. In the same session Parliament settled the succession of the throne on Elizabeth as born from the king's only lawful marriage, and enabled him to appoint a commission consisting of Cranmer, Audley, who had succeeded Sir Thomas More as Chancellor, and the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, which should impose on all English subjects an oath to defend the Act of Succession and all the whole contents and effects thereof. They then drew up a bill of forbidden degrees in marriage, in conformity with the book of Leviticus, and, as Blackstone says, on the general principle that marriage is not barred by a relationship more remote than that between uncle and niece. Finally, the Parliament declared that on separating from the Pope they had not intended to decline or vary from the articles of the Catholic faith of Christendom, or from anything declared in the Word of God to be necessary for salvation. End of Section 17.